And welcome in, Draft Nicks. Hi, I'm Chris Mack. This is Draft Nation, and we are ready to talk hockey. Yes, we're only about 2 weeks into the season, but there's obviously, especially if you're a Penguins fan, plenty to talk about. And around the league, really, plenty to get into. Plus, some interesting stuff up at draftnation.com where you want to become a member today. If you haven't yet, you could do that for free at draftnation.com. And make sure you're joining everybody else who's getting the best content, including from our friend Kelsey Surmacz of the Hockey News, who joins me now. Kelsey, thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it today. And I want to start here. You have a new piece up at draftnation.com, just basically outlining some of the biggest misses, right, over the last decade or so in the first round of the NHL draft. And you managed to find some names that, I'll be honest, I had not heard in a long time. Some names that I think fans had probably forgotten. And for Penguins fans or Hurricanes fans joining us from the Draft Nation platform, we'll get into those teams in just a little bit. But I want to start with this piece that I thought was fascinating and just kind of look at it from a 50,000-foot perspective, Kelsey, based on your research and some of the names that you dug up. Which organizations do you think are doing the best and maybe worst jobs over the last decade, which you researched pretty heavily, of capitalizing on, high-end draft capital?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the best. So I do think one of them is kind of we're starting to see the fruits of those labors this season, and that's the Utah Hockey Club. I think they've done an excellent job just compiling a really good core of young players. They also didn't appear on this list, so so that's a good thing. So yeah, I mean that's the first team that kind of comes to mind for me. I also think the Los Angeles Kings have done a pretty good job over the years of really capitalizing on their draft capital and turning it over pretty quickly as well. On the other end of that coin, I do think the Flyers kind of stand out.
Yeah.
It's going back to my very first one was actually Samuel Maureen. And I don't even know if people remember that name, but that draft class was a really good draft class back in 2013. And they drafted him 11th overall. Didn't really do much. Injuries kind of hindered his development. But that's kind of one team that comes to mind. Another one's the New York Islanders. They've kind of been middling for a really long time. There haven't been too many big hits as far as their first round draft picks over the last 10 years that have really put them in a position to be a cup contender, a true cup contender. So those are two of the teams I think that come to mind through this. And I'd say too, I mean, I think the one that was most interesting from this list that I pulled was Boston's 2015 draft class. Now, this isn't a case where Boston's been unsuccessful, but I did find it pretty interesting. They actually had 3 picks in a row that year. So they had the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. 14th ended up being pretty good success for them because, but basically their 13th and 15th picks, which was Jakub Zboril and Zachary Senshin. Nobody's heard of them since that draft. So I think that's a good example of really making the most of your first round picks and them kind of missing on 2 out of their 3 that year. Because they did draft Jake DeBrusk in the middle there.
Yeah, I was going to say Jake DeBrusk falling in at 14 there. I know unless you're a Bruins fan, you definitely don't remember them having 3 picks in a row. And even if you are a Bruins fan, you're probably doing everything you can to forget picks 13 and 15, like you said. And 14 has turned out all right with Jake DeBrusk. Speaking of that scenario or any other ones, you mentioned the Flyers ended up on this list twice. Just what were some of maybe the blast from the past names or scenarios that when you went back to research some of the biggest first round misses over the last decade that you went, oh man, I forgot about this or that?
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, the Bruins kind of really stood out to me because it's rare that you get 3 picks in a row within the first 15. So that was kind of the big one that jumped out to me.
Right.
But honestly, Marine's a big name that I completely forgot about because if I remember correctly, I think he was kind of a pretty highly touted prospect that fell a little bit before the draft. So he was kind of a name that stood out to me. I still think Alex Turcotte is a big miss for the Los Angeles Kings as well. Even though they've drafted pretty well over the years, I do think that's kind of their one miss. They drafted him 5th overall in 2019. So those were kind of some of the names that I honestly forgot that Turcotte was drafted as high as he was till I went back to this list. But yeah, Boston and Philadelphia are still the ones that stand out for me, and Marine especially.
Yeah, that 2013 draft that you mentioned is just ridiculous to go back and look at. I mean, McKinnon first overall, of course, Barkov second, Jonathan Drouin went third to Tampa, Seth Jones, Elias Lindholm, Sean Monahan, Darnell Nurse. So even though we're getting to some names that aren't quite as accomplished as the other big names, like we're still getting to guys who are still everyday players in the NHL. Ristolainen to Buffalo. Horvat was 9th. Nichushkin went 10th overall. So the first 10, bing, bang, boom, all the way down the list, you're getting guys who are maybe future Hall of Famers in McKinnon's case, definitely perennial all-stars, or at the very least, everyday players. And then 12th, Max Domi, 13th, Josh Morrissey, and there's Samuel Marin at 11th overall to the Flyers.
Yeah. And I just want to go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was going to say that's that's typical of what this list, and again, people can go to draftnation.com, read the whole list, but that's typical of what I think each of these names was that you kind of isolated for each year over the last decade. Is like you go back and then you see the names around them, and it's great revisionist history. We do this in all sports, but you go back and go, oh man, they could have had this, that, or the other guy.
Yeah, and I think the same thing when you look back at the 2015 draft. The 2015 draft was loaded. And that's why I think those 2 picks for Boston are just even more baffling nowadays when you look back on them, because you look back on some of those names in the 2015 draft, and it's the same thing. So it's crazy how important those draft picks become, and how important those misses become as well, because they can really build the foundation for an organization, especially if you're in a position to rebuild.
And for teams that don't end up using these first round picks all the time, Kelsey, on actual draft picks, sometimes they deal them at the deadline. Certainly Penguins fans will be familiar with this because it became a tradition under Jim Rutherford and even Ron Hextall to a lesser extent. Just in general, as you went back and researched the last decade of the draft or so, based on how volatile the value of those picks are and how big the misses can be or the hits can be when you do hit them, how do you think franchises who willingly are dealing those first round picks often, what kind of value do you think they've gotten for them as compared to the draft picks that could have been made, compared to those present day improvements that they made maybe at trade deadlines over the years? Which teams are handling that well, and maybe which teams didn't handle it well over the last decade that you researched?
Yeah, well, I think handling it well is a little bit subjective in itself, because, I mean, you look at a team like the Penguins, they sacrificed a lot of picks for a lot of years, but they had a lot of success because of that. And I think now we're kind of getting to the point where we're seeing the consequences of doing that. And I do think, I mean, there's a pretty big difference between the 1 to 15 and the 15 to 32. So, I mean, I think it's very dependent on where a team's drafting, where their first round pick falls. A lot of that has a lot of value attached to it. But I think just in general, it's so hit or miss on either direction, because you think of, like I said, situations like the Penguins where they were pretty much a hit for years and years and years. And then, you have situations where, you think of teams like Edmonton where that hasn't been so much the case. So I think it all depends on where that pick falls, because there's definitely a ton of value in those first 15 slots. But once you really move beyond that, I think that's, if you're looking at a late first round pick and you're a team that's looking to contend, that's a dice you roll every time, I think.
Yeah. Follow Kelsey on Twitter at Kelsey_Surmacz4. Kelsey_Surmacz4. She is definitely doing a great job with not just the research into this piece, but what's going on in the league right now. And that's where I wanted to pivot to, Kelsey. Present day, we're about 2 weeks into the regular season. So it's really, really early, but just who or what around the league are some of your biggest surprises so far, or maybe some of your biggest disappointments? Players, teams, anything in general?
Yeah, so I kind of already mentioned this team, but I'm really liking what I'm seeing from the Utah Hockey Club so far this season. I really think that they figured something out this year. Logan Cooley, he hasn't scored a goal yet, but he looks really, really good. I think so far this year. Clayton Keller, 4 goals, 4 assists. So they kind of have this whole, like I said, core of young players. They're all producing. So I mean, they have 6 players at a point per game right now. I think the biggest question mark with Utah is going to be their goaltending.
Yeah.
And if we look around the league so far this season, goaltending has been quite the story. But I do think as long as they kind of get around league average goaltending, this is a playoff team this year. So they've been a nice surprise so far. I'm kind of intrigued by Calgary's start.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's going to last, but there are a lot of things going around the rumor mill right now that Calgary is looking to add to the roster. So I'm kind of curious to see how that plays out. And as far as disappointments, I mean, I think the obvious choice here is Colorado. They just look a mess in all 3 zones. Their goaltending is league worst. So if I cover the Penguins, I know a lot of people are kind of complaining about the goaltending situation in Pittsburgh. But yeah, Alexander Georgiev, 499 goals against average right now, 811 save percentage. Things are rough over in Colorado right now. Nathan MacKinnon only has 2 points. He has 2 assists. So it's a very slow start all around for them. And I'm kind of curious to see how they pick it up in the coming weeks here.
What about another team out west? I was really high on Nashville in the offseason and coming into this year. Still, I mean, we're 2 weeks into the season. They haven't won a game. What do you see from the Preds to this point? Is it, I don't know. I looked at it, I saw Stamkos, I saw, keeping most of the core together. And I thought, okay, yeah, this is a team that looked really good down the stretch in the regular season last year. Wasn't able to capitalize maybe on a deep run into the playoffs, but you go out and you add an established, future Hall of Famer in Stamkos's case. And I thought, okay, this is the perfect sort of cherry on top. And it's been tough to watch the first couple weeks.
Yeah, definitely. And their special teams are a mess too. I'm wondering if this is one of those situations where just things haven't gelled yet. I'm still pretty high on them. I think they're going to come around a little bit. But I do think, kind of like we talk about again, Pittsburgh's power play. I just think there might be just too many cooks in the kitchen right now. Because they went out and got some big name players in the offseason. And I just think it's a matter of things gelling for them. Because right now, everything just looks really disjointed. It doesn't look like they have an established identity up to this point. So again, I mean, I think this is a team that's going to figure it out down the stretch. And I know they got really hot in the second half last year. So I'm kind of looking for things to improve for Nashville over the next couple weeks, but so far nothing's coming together in the way that they had hoped, I think.
So we talked a bunch of Western teams, and rightfully so. You mentioned Utah, you bring up Colorado. We discussed Nashville for a second. What about the East? I know we're going to get to the Penguins in a minute, both of us being Pittsburgh-based. I know we'll touch on the Canes as well, being that they're another team under the Draft Nation umbrella who gets covered very closely. But what else in the East? I mean, I see the Rangers continue to look like the Rangers, right? The Devils look like they've figured some things out after a disappointing finish last year. And the Panthers look like the reigning Cup champs. So where else what else has caught your eye maybe in the East as far as hot hands, slow starts? What's surprised you or maybe disappointed you so far?
So I think one team that's definitely surprised so far is the Capitals. I think they're obviously in a similar situation to the Pens where their core is aging. It's the last season when they made the playoffs, they were probably one of the worst teams ever to make the playoffs. So, but they did go out this off season. They got Mangiapane, they got Chikrin, and so far, I mean, that's paying dividends for them. I do think that this is a team I can see kind of being on the fringe and maybe grabbing one of those final playoff spots again this year, because their process just looks simplified. It just looks like they're kind of, like I said, the new guys that they brought in have really fit in well, fit into the mix. So they're kind of a team that has been a little bit of a pleasant surprise. And also they're getting the goaltending up to this point too. So that's kind of been, I guess out of the East, if I had to pick a team that's kind of caught my eye in a surprising way, it's definitely the Caps so far.
All right, you brought the magic word up, so here we go. And you mentioned it earlier, goaltending. Penguins fans got an unusual thing yesterday. Today is Monday. Yesterday was Sunday. They were in Winnipeg to start this big Western road trip. Typically, Mike Sullivan would walk out there a few hours before drop of the puck and say, "Hey, Tristan Jarry's going tonight. Alex Nedeljkovic, Joel Blomqvist, whoever it's going to be, is the starting." Didn't name one. Everybody got to find out when they skated out on the ice, when the puck was dropped, that it was Alex Nedeljkovic. They also got to notice that Tristan Jarry was nowhere in sight, despite all three goalies coming on the Western road trip. So let's start there. What is the state of the Penguins goaltending situation? Because a lot of guys in the locker room after the loss to the Jets in Winnipeg Sunday night made a very good point of saying it's not the goaltender's fault right now. It's the way we're playing in front of them. But it's hard to ignore the fact that Nedeljkovic, granted just one game to this point, and Blomqvist seem to be handling the opportunities they've been given better than Tristan Jarry has. And Jarry still looks out of sorts and looks like a guy who is nowhere near ready to be put back between a pair of NHL pipes.
I would agree. And I think this dates back to last season. I mean, this is something I brought up a couple times, but Nedeljkovic started the last 13 games last year, including that last final meaningless game against the New York Islanders, which, I mean, if that was kind of a sign in the organization, in the organization's confidence level in Jarry, that was definitely the first sign. There were rumors that he was on the trade block over the summer. So I think, honestly, I can't envision that organizational confidence in Jarry is very high right now. I think it's very telling that Nedeljkovic comes back day one. Blomqvist remains the backup. Jarry scratched last game. Now, I do think, I mean, I would expect to see some kind of rotation on this Western road trip. I don't think Jarry is going to be the consistent healthy scratch in the mix. I think they're going to kind of, if I had to guess, they're going to kind of rotate guys in. But I do think, first of all, it's interesting that they kept three goaltenders for this trip. I think some were kind of half expecting Blomqvist to be sent back to the AHL when that didn't happen. And like I said, he was named the backup yesterday. I think it rightfully does stir a lot of questions about what the organization's standing is with Jarry. And I think ideally, if you're the Penguins, he's got that big contract. Ideally, you want him to get hot, right? You want him to hit a hot streak, make his trade value go up, so you're able to deal that contract. Because the Penguins have goaltending depth. They have Blomqvist, they have Murashov, they even have Larson, who's been pretty good up to this point. So goaltending depth is not an issue for Pittsburgh. And I think if everything goes the way that they would want it to, Jarry goes on a hot streak and he increases his trade value, because there are teams like Colorado that really need goaltending help. And that's an ideal situation for them. So I still think he's going to see some games here to see if he can kind of, catch a hot streak.
So I'm glad you mentioned the Avs, because that was going to be my next question. You led right into it. Who are some of the teams out there that would have any interest in Tristan Jarry, whether it be right now? I can't imagine there's a lot of teams ringing Kyle Dubas's phone off the hook about Jarry at this particular moment. But if he should get things back together, who are some teams out there that may have interest in making a move for Jarry and not necessarily forcing Dubas and the Pens to eat the bulk of the contract?
See, that's the trick. I think a lot of contending teams are kind of strapped against the cap. Colorado is one of them. They have a lot of injuries right now. So they would have to work a little bit to make that work, and Jarry's contract work into their roster. But I mean, Colorado's top of the list. I even think when you're looking at this from an objective perspective, it's Georgiev is not, I don't think, a top tier starting goaltender in the National Hockey League. So they'd be first on the list if they could make the cap work. I'm also kind of still eyeing Nashville a little bit. It's a little bit of a similar situation there, but their goaltending hasn't been off to the best start either. So those are two teams I'm kind of keeping an eye on at the top of the list, but I also wouldn't keep Edmonton out of the question. I know that this is kind of Edmonton's floated around every single year. This isn't something new. And Stuart Skinner is a very inconsistent goaltender. So I really think still the thing that's missing for Edmonton to really push them over the edge for a Stanley Cup is goaltending. So if it's something where they're kind of looking to swap a guy out for a change of scenery, I could definitely see that as well.
So the other side of this coin is we've seen Joel Blomqvist play really well when he's been given these opportunities early on. And I imagine if they were able to do something in moving on from Jari, if they had to go that direction, they'd be comfortable with Nedeljkovic and Blomqvist at this point. But looking at it from the other side of the coin, it's, how good should they feel about the development of a young goalie playing behind a team who's playing the way they are right now? My worry would be, and I don't know if you had the same thoughts at all, that Blomqvist, his development, as well as it's gone to this point, could get stunted at some point playing behind a team who some nights looks disinterested at best in putting up a defensive effort in front of their goaltender.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a situation to monitor here. I mean, even if the Penguins were able to move on from Jari in any capacity, I still think you see a pretty healthy split between Blomqvist and Nedeljkovic. Because I mean, I do think there are some things to tighten up with the Penguins defensively. I think it's an understatement to say that they've been pretty putrid up to this point in their own zone, but at the same time, I mean, I think there's something to be said about him being able to step up in those big moments. I kind of trace back to that second period against Buffalo where he made 3 breakaway saves. He made a huge save on a 2-on-1 during 4-on-4 play. And that kind of kept the Penguins in the game and allowed them to come back into it. And I think you saw right then and there, like the value of good goaltending in the National Hockey League. And they hadn't been getting that from Jari. So I think it's kind of a multifaceted issue. You don't want to, if this defense continues to play the way that it has, you don't want to stun his growth, stun his confidence. So I think regardless of what happens, we're going to see a pretty steady rotation going in. And I think that's probably the best thing for Blomqvist at this point, rather than just, throwing him to the wolves, because that's kind of what's happening right now.
Yeah, they're facing some heavy hitters out west. They lose to Winnipeg to kick off the road trip, who's still undefeated. Then you get Edmonton, a red-hot Calgary team to start the season, and then Vancouver, who some people think is one of the best teams in the West as well. So if they could come back home with 4 points on a 4-game trip, I think that might feel like, treading water at this point out west might be the best thing we could expect of these Penguins over the next week plus. I did want to pivot to the Canes. Because obviously Draft Carolina falls under that Draft Nation banner as well as Draft 412. And I mean, we could talk interesting goaltending situations there between Anderson and Kochetkov. Anderson has looked really strong, I think, to start the season. And they had some special team struggles in their first couple of games. They've only played 4 games to this point. You got other teams in the league who've played 7 or 8. But the special teams came around over the weekend. Even if they didn't get a win, if they weren't able to come back after a slow start against the Blues over the weekend, they're 3 of 8 on their last 8 power plays. They've killed their last 9 penalties as well, shorthanded. So they happen to be headed out west at the same time as the Penguins. Just what do the Canes need to find while they're out in Alberta and the Pacific Northwest?
One of the things that kind of stood out to me, and even when we were talking to Mike Sullivan in his presser after the Hurricanes beat the Penguins 4-1 on Friday, one of the things that he pointed out is that just how simple their game plan is and how they simplify things on the rush. He mentioned how they kind of play on top of you. I think honestly they're again establishing that identity of just being very hard to play against, and that's something that we again didn't necessarily see in the first couple games of the season. But I do think special teams coming around for them is a big deal. Like you said, I think Anderson's having a hot start, which is probably about the best thing that could have happened for them, because if I think there's been one weakness on that roster over the past several seasons, it's definitely been goaltending. It's just been kind of inconsistent. So if he can kind of keep up pretty consistent goaltending play, that'll be a big plus for them. Special teams. But I just think like the thing that makes Carolina so dangerous is just the simplicity of their game. And like I said, Sullivan kind of pointed that out after the game, how the Penguins were never really ever able to get to their game on Friday night. So I think honestly, just simplifying things on the rush, playing that on top of other teams' style that Sullivan mentioned. If they keep playing to their identity, that's going to be they're going to be another dangerous team this year. To be honest, going into the season, I wasn't super high on them.
Yeah.
But after watching them these last few games, I think they're kind of reminding you why they're such a good regular season team. And they're going to be right up there at the end of the year.
One last thing, Kelsey, or maybe a couple little things before we let you run. It wouldn't be Draft Nation if we didn't take an uncomfortably, and I mean uncomfortably early look at prospects for next year's draft in LA. So, I mean, we're talking about being 2 weeks into the collegiate season here in the States. And granted, up north of the border, they've been playing juniors for nearly a month now, but not a lot of games have been played for draft eligible players to this point. But what are some of the names people should be listening for or keeping an eye out for when it comes to next year's batch of prospects?
Yeah, so one guy I'm kind of keeping an eye on is Charlie Trethewey. He's a defenseman. He's actually in the USHL. And he did play for the Little Penguins elite program, as well as the Pens elite programs for a few years. But he's a defenseman. He's a really, really good playmaker. He's got a heavy shot, and he's also very physical. I think he's a guy, a defenseman who might be able to kind of accelerate his development process just because of the way he plays. Right now, I mean, I think he's probably a mid first round pick. I do think his draft capital, his draft stock rather, could rise. Because I don't know if you've watched this guy at all, but his playmaking ability is off the charts for a defenseman. And his puck handling ability is impressive. So he's definitely one guy I'm keeping an eye on, Charlie Trethewey.
Kelsey, one more prospect-related thing I wanted to touch on before we let you run, because your colleague from the Hockey News, Ryan Kennedy, just mentioned this on Monday morning on Twitter, posted there that he's heard from a source that the next NHL CBA could feature AHL eligibility for 19-year-olds. Just for those that don't understand what that means for teams going forward, if it were to become a thing, how would that change things, I guess, for prospect development between the junior or I guess between being drafted, right? Between the junior and collegiate levels and the NHL level.
Yeah, so I think that is a pretty big change, because as of right now, you do have to be 20 years old to be AHL eligible. So a lot of 19-year-old prospects are kind of being sent, being sent back on for a second year of juniors right now. And I mean, my honest opinion, I think this would be good for prospect development, because I do think in a lot of cases, especially with higher end prospects, them being sent back to juniors at age 19 isn't really doing much to help their development, I don't think. If you're sending a younger guy back, an 18-year-old maybe, but guys being 19 and being able to kind of get a taste of the AHL, they're kind of being exposed to that higher level professional hockey at an earlier age. I think there are some cases where that could expose a few guys. But as far as the higher end prospects, I definitely think this is something that makes sense. Because you're kind of getting rid of that extra year of juniors that would be required for them. On the other side of the coin, it also is a big deal for NHL franchises in terms of entry level contracts. Because obviously, as it stands now, a player only starts burning through their ELC once they go to the AHL. So, if 19-year-olds become eligible for for the AHL, that's going to be a year earlier that they're starting to burn out years of their ELC, which could down the road become potentially problematic for especially those mid-level prospects, some of the lower first-round draft picks maybe, who aren't quite ready for the NHL out of the gate, but they need a few years of development. So I think there's a little bit of a gray area there. It's good for the top prospects. It's not so good for NHL organizations as a whole with their prospect pool, I don't think.
Yeah, adds an extra layer to the feeling out process, I guess, especially early in the season when traditionally you'd see GMs look at a player from juniors and say, okay, we can stash them back in juniors for the rest of the year. Like you said, not burn a year of that entry-level contract. Well, now you may have to weigh whether it's more important to get him those AHL reps, those AHL minutes, rather than sending him back to juniors to light up the scoreboard for 6 months before you give him another taste of the NHL. Kelsey, thanks so much for the insight today. Great stuff. Really appreciate it. For those that haven't yet, you can't miss the piece she did on the biggest first-round draft misses of the last decade. Go check it out right now at draftnation.com. Be sure to follow Kelsey on social media at Kelsey_Surmacz4. And, of course, she'll have plenty on what's going on around the league for the Hockey News as well as for the Penguins, specifically in Pittsburgh. We'll hope to catch up again soon, Kelsey. Thanks so much for the time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.